All right, everyone, let's get started. My name's Steve House. I'm one of the co-founders of Uphill Athlete, and I'm looking forward to hosting a talk today with my fellow co-founder, Scott Johnston, and my former coach as well for a long time, and our master coach, Sam Naney. And one of the things that's going to be really interesting about this is the kind of history of Scott and Sam and how they've worked together. So Scott, why don't you sort of introduce what you're going to talk about and tell us a little bit about Sam?
Sure, absolutely. Thanks, Steve, and welcome, Sam. This is our first ever attempt at coach interviews, so we'll see how this goes. We'd like to do this sort of thing with all of our coaches because they've all got great stories to tell, and we've all known each other a long time and had a lot of shared experiences, and so I think it's valuable because I don't think there's much of that sort of connection in most of the coaching organizations that we know of. So I think it's kind of nice that we can show a little of the history here. Plus, we're going to be talking today about some of the evolution and developments of the main training theories and ideas that you've read about in our books and on our website. So with me today is Sam Naney. We're here in the Uphill Athlete World Headquarters gym. We are not social distancing, but Sam and I are in what do we call a COVID pod, I guess. So we're, go back to that other picture though, Steve. I got to make this comment.
Sorry. I actually did not mean to.
Oh.
There we go.
So, this picture was taken at a November early season ski race. I don't know, probably 15 years ago or something like that.
Oh, it was like 7 years ago.
Oh, okay. Well, yeah, you were still in high school 15 years ago. That's right. So anyway, so my wife took one look at this picture and said, "Oh, that's a great picture. You look like you're 12, and Sam looks like he just stepped out of GQ magazine." So
aspirationally.
Yeah. Anyway, it's a little. So I've probably been slaving over a hot wax bench all day trying to make sure Sam's skis are fast, and hence my somewhat disheveled look. This is a post-race picture from when some race that we did, and from the glow on Sam's face, I'd say he won the race. Anyway. What Sam and I wanted, we've known each other since Sam was about 15 years old in high school. I wasn't his coach at that time, but after Sam returned from his stint at Dartmouth College, I did start working with him as a coach, and I think we have some of the story we want to relate today. I think will be helpful for people to understand where a lot of these training ideas came from. I know most people are already well aware of Steve's and my connection. I mean, we've talked about my coaching of Steve and the development of some of those training ideas many times over. One of the things that we know about coaching, and one of the reasons we stress the importance of coaching, is that the coach-athlete relationship is a rather intimate one. You get to know the person quite well. And especially in my case, where I'm actually standing beside these guys, watching them train, I can make judgments about, oh, we should try that, or we should do it this way, because I'm getting almost immediate feedback. But anyway, I'm going to turn it over to Sam to talk a little bit about how we first got together and when he approached me and started asking about training.
So I raced, grew up here in the Methow Valley and racing as a junior and in Nordic skiing. And Scott, you moved here, I think I was maybe 16 or 17, and helped out a little bit on the ski team. And we interacted just a bit before I went off to college. And then after my college racing career, I wanted to try to make a go of it as a elite level skier on the post collegiate circuit, and managed to, in the first year or so out of college, I was coaching myself and was able to bungle it pretty well, and within a year get myself pretty overtrained just in making all the classic mistakes. I led myself to believe that I had a level of fitness that could sustain a lot of hard training and really make a big step upward, given that I was basically able to be doing it full time versus in college. And I put myself into a really deep hole. And so that was when, and I ended up reaching out to you at the end of that first year out of college, realizing I was sort of at the bottom of the barrel. And I knew that you had been working with a lot of other juniors, and you had a deep knowledge of training and just had that trust in what you were able to offer. And we started communicating. At the time I was living in Montana, so we were just emailing back and forth, and then ended up coming back here to work with you directly.
Yeah, and I remember some of those early conversations really distinctly, Sam. I mean, when Sam, and we get a fair number of inquiries from folks who have managed to overtrain themselves. And as you probably know, we've written extensively, both on the website and in the books, about the phenomenon of overtraining. It's one that is glossed over, I think, way too much in endurance sports. I would consider myself quite knowledgeable. I've dealt with a number of overtrained athletes, including myself. I've managed to overtrain a couple of athletes, including myself. So I've learned a lot of lessons over 25, 30 years of dealing with how to deal with overtrained athletes. The bad news for most overtrained athletes is by the time they recognize they're overtrained and they come to somebody like me to ask for help, they are beyond help. Well, unfortunately.
Well, and you feel, yeah, I mean, it's, in some ways it makes it, if you've experienced it yourself, maybe even a couple of times, then it's easier to sort of diagnose those symptoms when somebody comes to you. But, the challenge with it is that it's often really insidious. You feel your training is going along and you see that you're putting up bigger numbers of, volume or intensity, or maybe even PRs, and everything's going great. And you think, gosh, I'm really absorbing this well. And and then there's this precipice, because you have this sort of superhuman sense, and it's not, you're ignoring those signals that say maybe you should balance your training with recovery. Yeah, it's easy to ignore those signals, particularly when you don't have any sort of objectivity in looking at it.
Exactly, and I really think that so my recommendation, I won't go into too much detail about overtraining because we spend so much time on the website talking about it, but so my immediate recommendation to Sam, which is the same recommendation I've given to every overtrained athlete, is stop doing whatever you're doing, which is an incredibly hard thing for an athlete to hear, because they realize when they stop training, they're going to begin to lose fitness. So but that was my first recommendation to Sam.
And that was 3 weeks before national championships.
Yes, that's not a great time to have to pull the plug on your training. But he was so overcooked that his national championships were not going to go well. We could be pretty sure of that. Shortly after that, Sam moved back to his hometown, and I began to work with him on a daily, one-to-one basis. And one of the very first things that we discovered, and I think this is a good lesson for folks, is so Sam was competing at quite a high level nationally, and I suspected that he was aerobically deficient. Now, that's another term, along with overtraining, that you've probably seen that we've written extensively about in the books and the website. Aerobic deficiency syndrome is something that can exist even in a quite high-level athlete. So we discovered Sam's aerobic deficiency with a couple of very simple tests. Some of these tests we talk about in the book. And I said, okay, here's where we start. I mean, and so for someone like Sam, especially who's at a fairly high level, this was like having to go back to nursery school. I mean, it's like, okay, you're not ready for Shakespeare. You need a remedial reading lesson here. And so I think we spent 2 years roughly trying to move the needle and get his aerobic capacity up to where it needed to to try to compete at the level he was competing at, which pretty much meant no real fun, sexy, hard training. It was all base training for him. But then once we got that in place, things turned around, I think, for you.
Yeah, I mean, and that was the hard thing, is because I think I didn't recognize it because I didn't really know. I think something that's not atypical with junior athletes in any sport, particularly endurance sports, and then, as getting older, is you sort of just follow along with what you're told, basically, whether through coaches or just, sort of groupthink when you're training with a team or other training partners. You're all kind of pushing one another, and it's easy to not necessarily pay attention to what you as an individual are needing or maybe lacking. So I didn't have a good recognition that I was not aerobically fit. I just assumed that I was, because I was, competing in Nordic skiing and I had good results. And so it took some time, even after you had been, telling me and trying to convince me, like, no, actually you've got a big gap in your fitness. Certainly for me to realize that the types of training that I felt I should be doing at that point in my career were just not going to be practical. Like going out and doing hard intensity training like I knew other competitors were out doing, or as you say, like the sexy, hard, complex workouts were just not going to provide the gains to me versus going and doing several hours at or below the aerobic threshold and just building that base. I didn't understand that base was as important as it was, and I didn't understand that I didn't have it at that point.
Yeah, and it was, this is something, Sam, go, or Steve.
Interject a question there. A couple of questions. One, I would like to know, I think people would be interested to know, specifically, what were the things that signaled that you were going off the precipice, Sam? I mean, was it something that you were seeing, or Scott, was it numbers? Was it a feeling? And then the other thing I'd like to hear you talk about, Sam, for a second is how that experience has helped you in your own current coaching position as an uphill athlete.
Yeah. So if I think back, the year that I trained and basically coached myself prior to reaching out to Scott, I was doing a lot of volume. As I knew, like, okay, volume is really important. I need to be doing, 3 to 4 hour long trail runs, lots of volume during the week. I'd say the biggest mistake I made, and I think this is sort of the classic mistake that most athletes make when they push themselves into an overtrained state, is I was blending a lot of volume and a lot of intensity. So I was doing the work on the volume end, and I was monitoring my heart rate. I had a decent idea of where I needed to be training at a low intensity, but it was still fatiguing with the volume. And then I would turn around and I'd go do a hard intensity workout, and my base just wasn't robust enough to be able to handle that at that point in my life as a 19-year-old. And so again, as I said earlier, like, for a time I felt great, and I was really excited about how I was able to be doing a lot of training, and through a good part of that summer, I was seeing personal records on various little time trials and hills and things. And then by the time the fall came around, I think I was having trouble recovering, and the way that showed up would be like my times would drop on certain workouts. I would be just tired all the time, and I, for so long I just chalked it up to, I'm training a lot, that's why I'm tired. But I think really the main indicator for me, and again, I think this is often where it comes up for people, was the truly objective marker of showing up to the first couple of races that season, which are in the late fall, and just being out of the mix totally. My results in those races didn't line up with where I felt I should be based on the training load, and I would rest, and I would show up to the next race and think, okay, now it'll be good because I've rested. And it was still just a total flop. I pushed the accelerator and you just hear a sputter. And so that for me was, at that point, obviously, I was cooked. I had already gone over that cliff, but that was those were the main signals, like, oh, I'd done something bad. And that's when I reached out to Scott, and I think that's, again, it's why, in hindsight, it all makes sense, but it's really tough if you're not able to be observing the training load as it's occurring. Then you're just setting yourself up to, wait until that main indicator really tells you you're cooked. And I think, to your second question, Steve, like, what I try to think about when we're coaching athletes is whether it's using things like Training Peaks, where we can attempt to apply some sort of objective measure to the training load each workout, and I think personally, more importantly, is just having communication and creating a level of confidence between the coach and the athlete, to where when I ask somebody a question, how'd you feel today? Which I'm sure to to my athletes, they feel like it's just a broken record, because that's usually the question that I ask them for a workout. But what I want to receive in return is like, well, I felt amazing, or I felt like I couldn't get out of first gear. You know, it just those little indicators, and when you start piling them up into a data set, can give you a better big picture of what the trends are. And it's evaluating that in sum. You know, it's not going to be one single workout. It's just going to be learning the athlete and kind of reading what their capabilities are and where they're at. And I think what really came to evolve with my relationship with Scott and how we were able to kind of have this long-term coach-athlete relationship that worked is that he came to know me really, really well, you know, and a big benefit was that we were working side by side, and we'd show up to practices, to training sessions together. And I mean, there were days I know where you saw me within the first 5 minutes of starting a workout and you'd pull the plug. Like, I can tell you don't have it today. It's not a good day to train. And I think those are the, you know, we can get a pretty good feel for that even just through, you know, dialogue, you know, in text form with athletes. But for us, it was particularly robust because we could see that in person.
Yeah, that's great. I think that answers one of the questions we got about, you know, kind of the balancing the art and science of training and coaching with the subjective and the objective. Scott, can you tell me a little bit about what you saw at the end of those 2 years where you felt like you could start doing some of these other more, as you call it, sexy training methods?
Yeah, exactly. So this is, again, something we stress a lot in the book. I know it can sound a little bit like the broken record of aerobic base, aerobic base, aerobic base. But for all these endurance sports, it's the key. And without that base, trying to move into advanced levels of training, or what we might call event-specific type training, runs a huge risk of putting you in the same kind of place Sam was in. You know, at very best, it's going to produce mediocre results, and at worst, it's going to cause you to get overtrained. So once we began to see, and it didn't happen fairly quickly, but I think once we saw the first year Sam was racing, his results were, you know, after working with me, and we just spent that time working on base training, results were not impressive. You know, they were okay, but we didn't expect them to be impressive because you can't race off of base training. I mean, this is something we stress a lot, that's all this aerobic base training we keep talking about. That base is there to support training that prepares you for your event. So if all you've done is base training, and then you go into an event like cross-country skiing that has a lot of very high intensity work during a race, you're not going to be well prepared for that high intensity. So we were only able to do a little bit of high intensity training because I didn't want to risk putting Sam over the edge again, and we wanted to really focus on that base. But then after a couple of seasons of this, it was really obvious that we'd made a huge breakthrough in Sam's base level of fitness, aerobically especially. And then we began to introduce some novel, we use, of course, some conventional training methodologies out of, you know, from cross-country skiing and running and that sort of thing. But one of the things that I think has been really a founding principle of certainly my coaching philosophy, and I think it's sort of morphed now into and been absorbed into Uphill Athlete, is that we're very willing to look outside of our own little sphere of knowledge and influence, see what goes on in other sports, see how you know, we can learn from that, we can experiment, and we can take stuff. You know, we've used ideas that came out of swimming and rowing and cycling and running, all those other endurance sports that are much better studied than obviously even cross-country skiing, and certainly much better studied than any of these other mountain sports that we tend to focus on now. And some of those ideas were, I have to say, kind of radical at the time. Maybe you want to show that picture, the hyperoxic little video, Steve, if we can pull that up. If you can find it. But so this type of training, you're muted, Steve.
Sorry, I was muted here. Let me share this now. This is
Yeah.
what Scott is talking about, hyperoxic training. Let me play this.
So hyperoxic training means training with way more than atmospheric levels of oxygen. And we did this by putting an oxygen welding tank in my van, running a boom out the side, and then supplying oxygen from that tank into a mask. So this isn't actually Sam, it's another athlete I worked with at the same time. So it's a little hard, it's kind of grainy, I'm sorry, it's not so good. But so the reason we tried this, and it actually worked amazingly well.
We were going really fast.
Yeah, that was skiing, that guy was skiing uphill,
Like
moderate grade at about
25
25 plus miles per hour uphill. I mean, that's pretty hard to do even on a bicycle.
and not get run over by the car.
Yeah. Notice that he has to get out of the way for an oncoming car here.
And not get run over by your car.
And Mike, I'm over in the ditch trying to keep from, give him a little room. But anyway, the rationale behind this was, so this guy and Sam, their specialty was an event that lasts about 3 minutes. So it's really high intensity. It's called the sprint in cross-country skiing. And so they're going to be using, from our books, we talk a lot about the different fiber types, fast twitch, slow twitch fibers. Well, in an event that lasts 3 minutes, the fast twitch fibers and the endurance of those fast twitch fibers is really critical. So that's an important thing to think about how can we improve endurance of fast twitch fibers? Well, we have to be able to use them. But normally, if you're using those fast twitch fibers, they get fatigued in, a few seconds, between 10 and 30, 45 seconds. And those fibers that you want to be training, they're done, and they might need many minutes of rest. They might even need, a full day to recover because they're not very well endurance adapted. So I had this idea that, okay, why don't we just let you guys breathe tons of oxygen? You can go really hard for a long time that way without fatigue. So they're going to be able to use these fast twitch fibers that generally can only be trained for maybe a few minutes in one workout. They were doing as much as 39 minutes. We were doing 3 13-minute uphill repetitions this way. So they had 39 minutes of very heavy training stimulus to those fast twitch fibers that you couldn't get otherwise in a workout. It might take you several months to accumulate that much volume of high intensity training.
But I think what the interesting thing was in experiencing it was that at the time, like when we were doing those workouts, it felt awesome. I mean, as you like, it felt like doping in a sense because you were skiing, we knew how fast we were skiing, but it felt sustainable in the way that, just kind of a fun, fast level effort would feel in normal times, but we were moving really, really well. But the ensuing days, I mean, you'd just be totally spanked.
Yeah.
Because you're basically like, you're overcoming the inhibition that the brain is the central governor of your workload. You're able to, in some ways, kind of bypass that by giving it the signal that it's got enough oxygen to do a higher level of work than it's trained to do. But then you remove the oxygen, you end the workout, and the recovery is, suddenly you have to compensate for this much higher workload than you've been used to doing. So it was a really taxing workout in terms of, making sure we recovered well from it. But I think, the effect of it was equally valuable because, again, you're learning this economy of movement and being able to ski, in this case, being able to ski really well with good technique at a very high speed. And I think, thinking about what we've tried to do in sort of taking that concept and what I've tried to think about in like, well, how can I apply that experience to working with other athletes is a concept that's really well used in running training, would be something like downhill speeds. So you take an environment where your gravity is now working more in your favor, and you can train short bursts of speed, 10, 15 seconds, running downhill, working really well on good technique and form. So you're training that economy, you're training the quick cadence, but you're not having to at the same time overcome an additional applied load of gravity or even flats. So it's it's similar, but much more approachable than putting a welding tank in the back of a car and skiing along or running along behind it. Yeah, it was wild. It was a fun way to train.
And we saw tremendous results from that. I'll just say that season was probably, that guy who you saw skiing, that was his best World Cup season. And I think it put Sam on the podium at U.S. National Championships. So it was a very good training methodology. I mean, but I would caution people, this is not something you need to, don't try this at home. It's something that only a very advanced athlete, it's a little bit dangerous to do that outdoors. I mean, but I'll give you an idea how I got this, where this came from. I was reading a research study on hyperoxic training for cyclists. And there was someone who had done this exact same thing, basically having stationary bikes set up for professional cyclists to train in a hyperoxic state. And they saw massive performance gains. And I thought, how could we do that? Well, stationary, we can't do stationary skiing. So that's when I started thinking, okay, we'll just throw the welding tank in the car and drive around with it. Luckily, we have some pretty not very heavily traveled roads around here, so we were able to do that.
We did get some strange looks, though.
Yeah, very strange looks.
A couple of people who didn't want to move over very much.
But that was an example of using this sort of looking to other sports, looking to see how other people are maximizing their training. And so with regards to that, we also talk a lot about muscular endurance training. And this is something that has become a mainstay of the uphill athlete training methodologies at every level for every type of athlete. And we have different types of muscular endurance training routines that will apply to different folks. So when I was looking at muscular endurance, my first experiment with it happened in about 1992 when I was helping a guy prepare for the 92 Olympics. Steve. You're muted. You're muted.
Scott, before we go to muscular endurance, there was a good question here about is this O2 doping training methodology that you've been discussing? Is it specific to sprinters and higher speed events, or is it also something that applies to more longer endurance athletes? That's a good question.
No, I mean, it's a good question, and I think one thing I was actually going to say about it is like we tried it a handful of times, but we didn't necessarily stick with that method as a long-term training tool. Like it was one of those, like Scott was talking about, like an opportunity to try a method that could tackle a certain problem we were trying to work out, which is how can we train at a more sport-specific speed with a higher volume of that work? Because I mean that if you boil down training, the whole idea is to try to gain as specific training and try to do a high measure of work from which you can recover and adapt to it. And in using it, we saw that it could be really beneficial, but we also saw that the recovery from that sort of load was pretty high, and that we could use different training methods that were more sustainable in a whole block of training. But I think to that question that was asked, like whether it's sprinting versus longer distance events, having that economy of movement is really valuable. And there are a lot of ways you can train economy of movement at high speed, short sprints and things like that. But I think they're definitely applicable to long distance events, because the objective is still to move as fast as possible over whatever given distance you're trying to do.
So regarding that same question, I'll elaborate a little more. Sort of my take on it was, recall that we use a periodized approach to training. So this was training that occurred, I think we probably did a total of 4 of these workouts spread out over between 10 to 14 days apiece in October and early November, just before we entered the racing season. This was not something we were doing in base training. This was after these guys had, enormous base training or base capacity so they can handle something like this. And even then it was really hard for them. So this wouldn't be something I would suggest you do on a daily or a weekly basis. It's something that will bring a person up to peak form. We found out really well and pretty rapidly if they're prepared for it. I would say that it could have some benefits in for long duration events, events lasting more than a few minutes. So remember, we talk about endurance. An endurance event is anything that lasts more than 2 minutes, because that's when the aerobic system becomes the dominant energy production source. So that's why we call those events endurance. So, but anything from 2 minutes to 2.5 hours or 4 hours, 10 hours, whatever, yes, I think it could have some benefit, but I think there's easier ways to do this. And one of the ones that we talk a lot about, it's in the books, is our hill sprints. So you can develop a lot of, for mountain runners, let's say, or ski mountaineers, they could do a very similar thing by doing these shorter duration, maximal effort uphill sprints with long recoveries in between them, and get almost all the benefit I'm sure that they could get from something like this without having to go to the extent of all the extra work and effort it was to do that kind of training. I think when we're talking about this kind of training, we're like, the difference between in these sprint races, the top 3 or 4 guys are all going to be within a half a second of each other. So we're talking about the less than 1% difference for these athletes. So it's not really something that most people will be needing to mess with. Does that cover that? Should we move on to muscular endurance?
That's a great point. And Dirk Friel had a point in the comments that he has trained on his bike with a small O2 tank and a Camelback to try to get to sea level, because he's lives over in Boulder, and he's for cycling training. He's trying to just get down. So that would be another similar type of application of this type of sort of outside the box thinking. So it's a great example. So sorry, I cut you off. You're about to segue into a different topic of muscular endurance.
Yeah, so I think that talking a little bit about muscular endurance and the development of the kind of the uphill athlete muscular endurance philosophy that has, again, like I said earlier, it's kind of become a mainstay, along with this whole aerobic base thing, that muscular endurance has become pretty much a mainstay of the way we train people for every event. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about the history. I mentioned that, I briefly alluded to that in one of the talks Steve and I had earlier, but I'll mention it again so that we have this continuity or history here. And I messed around with muscular endurance training when I was helping a guy prepare for the '92 Olympics in cross-country skiing. And I got these ideas from a speed skating coach on how they were training speed skaters at that time. And it was these incredible, this was CrossFit before CrossFit. And they were really demanding, high intensity circuit style workouts. And once again, these were something that was done in the late preparation period, right before competition. And so in the fall, we would do this type of training. And this guy had tremendous results, had the best American results that year at the Olympics. And so I saw that it was a really powerful training stimulus. I did the workouts along with him so I could get an idea of how they were affecting him. And I had huge improvement in my own performance. And I went, whoa, there's something going on here. So again, we were applying this on top of really big aerobic bases. Like, I was, and he was too. We were training close to 1,000 hours a year. So that's a lot of high volume of aerobic work that we're doing. So we could do that type of training. So anyway, after that, I started messing around. When I started coaching juniors, and then when I started working with Sam, I said, excuse me, let me back up. When I was working with Steve, he was doing the same type of muscular endurance work that I had used in some of my training for climbing, especially before I went to K2, of hiking steeply uphill with a heavy pack on, which is one of our more popular forms of doing muscular endurance training for mountaineers and alpinists. And I knew of a hill near where Steve lived that was a perfect thing. It was like a 30% or 40% gradient, very steep, straight up the fall line. And he could fill water jugs. You might have seen pictures in our book or on the website of Steve filling up water jugs in the river at the bottom, carrying the water jugs to the top, dumping them out, running back down. And as I recall, that climb was, I think, 1,700 feet. And there were days when you were putting in, 6,000 or 7,000 feet with, 30 or 40 pounds on your back.
Yeah, I actually remember 10, and I think I could look at my logs, but I think there was bigger days like 10 to 12,000 feet.
Yeah. And so anyway, that was one evolution of that muscular endurance idea. And then when I started working with the junior skiers and Sam, I wanted to revisit that sort of speed skater circuit style training that I had seen great results with, 10 years before or so. And so Sam and I worked on a similar type of a muscular endurance, high intensity circuit style thing that we did right here in this gym. Much to Sam's chagrin, because
I loved it. It's just really hard.
And there was one particular workout where Sam had to go outside and puke, and then my dog was out there eating it.
I thought it was a sign of success. I just got so blasted, and yeah, the dog ate the vomit. It was gross. But yeah, I mean, that was, and I think that kind of spoke as well to like learning how to apply these concepts to a sustainable training. Like I was approaching those workouts at basically maximal intensity, and each, we did it in a kind of a circuit. So we'd go from, box steps to jumping back and forth over a bar. I mean, some similar exercises that we prescribe now, but I was going as hard as I could, every single one, and just trying to get to the end of the circuit. And I would, it wasn't about sustainability. It felt just like, again, a maximal effort. And, we've since sort of evolved our learning to know that, the idea in that is to create a fatigue resistance in the fibers, not to take them very up, up to the maximal edge and then see if you can push them over. So that was, it was.
And that's one of those kind of things that I think, we're not afraid to say, hey, we were playing around, we were experimenting with stuff here. And yeah, we probably made some mistakes, did some things wrong, but we learned some really valuable lessons that we've now been able to, over the last, especially the last, 15 plus years, refine those into the systems that we use now, that we see, stellar results from, with very little, negative consequences. And so this whole, the muscular endurance circuit workout that we now have built into many of our training plans and is available free on the website. There's a PDF you could download right on the front page of that workout. There's a 10-week, maybe longer, I can't remember, 10 or 14-week progression. And we write about how to apply this, and you make best use of it. But I think that's one of those cases, and I want to have Steve pull up a couple of other little videos of when Sam and I were playing around with some different muscular endurance workouts. We were trying to find ones that were really specific to him for his cross-country sprint racing. And these are some that we messed with. Okay, this is one that we have this is about on a 20%, a little over 20% gradient hill. Yeah. I'm not sure why these are so jerky, but anyway, Sam's doing squat jumps with me on his back, and then dropping me and bounding up this hill to about 60 or 70 yards. At the top of the hill, I've placed a couple of hurdles that he then has to hop over and then do a few squat jumps at the top. And our idea behind that was that we could
Gets me every time.
we even tried this. The reason I'm on his back is that the first time we tried this, we used a 45-pound barbell with a couple of, I think, 45-pound plates on it. And then Sam would drop it, and I would be in the back to try to catch it, and it would roll down the hill and try to take me out. So I said, hey, let's do something a little, we don't have to drag the barbell out to the hill that way. And so instead, I acted as the barbell. I was heavier than 135 pounds, though.
It was another instance in which anybody who came along and saw our training was wondering what we were doing out there.
Did you want these hill sprints, the double pull?
You may have seen video of David Gutler on the website doing hill sprints for muscular endurance on a ski jump outrun, where he's doing it on the stairs of the ski jump. And so we've used all these different ways. Here's one that we used with Sam specifically for double pulling. And now he's towing me. We're using a bungee. I wonder why it's so jerky. So Sam is pulling me with a bungee up a pretty steep hill while he's double pulling, and we would do these are like 15-second little sprints. Sorry for the glitchy nature. You can see how much energy, effort he's putting into that. He's both roller skis are off the ground when he's in that full forward position, so he could put out this really maximal effort, and we did a bunch of different repetitions like that. It's not so important.
Scott, it's just your end. It looks fine here.
Oh, okay, great. I'm glad the video's working better. Yeah, we just have, we're in the middle of nowhere, so we don't have very good internet. Yeah. But so the reason for showing those is not to recommend that people go, double pole uphill towing their friend or whatever. It's more to show that this muscular endurance concept that we rely heavily on now in our training is one that we have used and adapted and messed around with now for many years. And we find it applicable to all sorts of activities. And it's almost like you can't do it wrong.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that we've talked about, and I think, particularly those videos and the time in which we were doing those and seeing them contribute really well was at that point where we put in that time building the base. And there, I think it just reinforced, certainly for me at that point, after the time that we'd spent working together and my training, and then what I've been able to take to coaching, is to recognize that when you've built the aerobic base, or you at least created a good foundation, you have a level of resilience that you can start using some of these techniques and seeing returns from them without them totally derailing you into fatigue, because the base is what supports that work. And even if you're experimenting with something and realize you need to back off, you can back off and recover and kind of regain your trajectory. But I think the mistakes that can be made, and I think we've all made them, is, again, like we talked about at the beginning, to try to add the sexy, flashy looking workouts right when you start training, to say, okay, I want to be an X, a really good skimo racer, Nordic skier, or runner. And I know that, there are these hot, flashy workouts out there, so I'm going to start doing those right away, because that's what's going to make me fast. And there's, even if there are short-term gains involved, it just doesn't have the sustainability, because that base is what allowed us to start throwing those at the wall and seeing what stuck without taking things off the rails.
Yeah, I think we can sort of use that iceberg analogy, that those, what we might call event-specific training, like the hyperoxic, or even some of the other work that Sam and I did. I don't think we have any video. I know we don't have any video of some of the high-speed strength or high-speed ski workouts that we did, but those are the tip of the iceberg that you can see. But what's under the surface that you can't see is all of the preparation that went into getting him able to handle that type of training. And that's the thing that I think the mistake that people make. It's when, especially, you see this in popular media all the time. So somebody breaks a world record in a running race, and immediately in the magazine, there'll be this, here's what so-and-so did in the last 4 weeks to prepare before they broke the world record. And it'll have all these amazing looking workouts, and people will immediately jump to the conclusion, oh, that's what allowed that person to break the world record. I'm going to go do those workouts because then I'll be faster too. When in fact, it was what this person, the world record holder, has done for the last 10 or 15 years that got them to the point where they could handle that kind of work. And most people would not be able to handle, 3200s run in 25 seconds with a 30-second rest. I mean, that's a great sounding workout for a runner to do, but most people would do that and just explode. So I think it's really important to keep this iceberg concept in mind, especially when you're reading popular media or you're hearing these amazing success stories, is what have you done for the last 10 or 15 years that got you to a point where you could handle it?
Well, and I think the other piece too, and it comes to my mind because I just saw one of those magazine articles we got in the mail, like there's a misconception too that the difference between athletes who are doing those sexy workouts and you, the person who's trying to aspire, is some level of toughness. Like, oh, well, if I'm just if I'm just tough like this athlete, then I can persevere through these really hard workouts. And yeah, I mean, there's certainly, there's a degree of, mental toughness you have to have just to train. But I would say there's a toughness that comes from doing a lot of base training as much as doing high intensity. And I think the mistake that gets made is when somebody thinks, well, if I just knuckle down, then I can sustain these hard workouts and I'll see the gains like so-and-so, the high level athlete. And what, again, kind of thinking back to my experience and as we evolved in this training, like those hard workouts, they were challenging, but they were sustainable because I had a base to support it. It was when I was trying to do them when I didn't have the base, when I would try to do a hard workout and it would just feel almost impossible. That was an indication I wasn't ready to do that hard training. And I think it's easy for us to mislead ourselves in thinking that it's only mental toughness that is the barrier between where we're currently at and where we can be. As opposed to thinking that you ratchet up the load according to what you're able to absorb and what you're able to do, and it's a tough measure. It's a tough patience to have, but I mean certainly the experience that I had, and finally realizing that, and then trying to apply it with other people.
And I think it's a great point, Sam, and I want to elaborate a little bit on it because I think this is another that iceberg concept. And what Sam is just talking about, being prepared for that hard training, is something that a lot of people don't get. But I want to use a real world example that I think often people can relate to. So most people are familiar, maybe you've never run one, but the road marathon. And what I think people don't realize is the road marathon, because it's a quite steady state, they're generally run on quite flat courses, and so in the tempo and the heart rate, the pace, all of those are fairly steady state during a race like that. They should be. There might be some surges here and there, but in general, these guys are going to be running at a pretty steady pace, guys and gals. But the interesting thing is that the road marathon is competed at or just a tiny sliver above a person's aerobic threshold. Now that term aerobic threshold should be pretty familiar to our listeners and people who've read our books. And so let that soak in for just a minute, that these guys, I'm going to use guys here as an example because it's even more crazy. So these top marathoners are running, especially the very fast ones, are running 26 miles at a 4-minute and 30-second per mile pace. And they're doing that in the same metabolic state at their aerobic metabolism is working just like yours or mine would be working. And we might be running a 4-hour marathon at that pace, or at that same threshold. So I think it shows you the power of the aerobic system. The aerobic system isn't necessarily just a slow system, but if it has to be trained to a very, very high level. I mean, these are professionals that have been putting in many, many years of training. And they also do some of that crazy, sexy type training that looks really cool. But the bulk of their training is done in that, even below aerobic threshold, because as you can imagine, for most of us, aerobic threshold training is a rather mundane pace, one that won't kind of destroy our muscles. But you can imagine if you could run a 4:30 mile at your aerobic threshold, and you thought that easy training was at aerobic threshold, you would very quickly find yourself overtraining if you went out every day and did 10 miles at 4 minutes and 30 seconds per mile. So those top runners, they don't do much training at that aerobic threshold pace. They have to do most of their base training much slower than that, or they'd end up getting overtrained. They can sustain that pace, again, because they've got this big base. And I think the takeaway for us with all these mountain sports that we train for, which most of which have durations that last, from just a couple of hours to many hours and even more than a day, that aerobic base pace becomes the event-specific pace. Now, in Sam's case, when he was cross-country sprint racing, that aerobic base pace was a long way below his event pace that he needed to be doing in a race. So that meant that's why we placed such a heavy emphasis on some of those high speed type training, because we did need to touch on it. But if you're going out and, even if you're not training for a race, if you're going out just to, get better at running 3 or 4 hours in the mountains at a time, then aerobic threshold is really your event specific training pace. And that's where you need to spend a great deal of your time. There will be a little bit additional of high intensity work, like Sam was talking about. It could be downhill sprints, it could be uphill sprints. But in general, that's why we put so much emphasis on that base training.
And that it's malleable. I mean, you can, just like whether it's a 4-minute race or it's a 7-hour 50-mile or 50K, you can increase that pace at your aerobic threshold through some of these different, through some moderate intensity and through just spending more time at that aerobic threshold. So you create efficiencies metabolically and muscularly, et cetera. So speed remains important in almost everything we're trying to do. We're trying to do it, faster for less effort. And so there's, you're getting the gains not in both places, and in the continued aerobic based training as well as in that selective, more kind of special training ideas.
I interject here. I'd like to go back a little bit to your personal story, Sam. We've got about 10 minutes left here, and we've got some pictures I'd like to make sure we get around to sharing and that ties directly into what you were just talking about as being a malleable athlete. So let me show some of these images and have you guys talk about them. I'll start with this image at, I believe this was at US Nationals. Oops. Share my screen. There we go. You guys want to talk about your own journey as an athlete, kind of beyond, through skiing and a little bit beyond, and you as well, both of you there? That'd be good.
Yeah, that was US Nationals. That was my last year competing, and it was the US Nationals in Nordic skiing. Kind of serves as sort of one of the bigger contributors to qualification for the Olympic teams in Olympic years. So that was for me. That was represented sort of my last opportunity to qualify for the games. And it was a high point certainly of my racing career. We had, Scott and I at that point had been working together for 7 years or so, and through all these stories, as you could tell, like we'd really kind of honed in on really quality training, and it was this culmination where my fitness had ascended to such a point where we could apply training and really see the gains, and we could apply a fair bit of training because I could absorb it. So that was, that image is taken in a sprint, and I didn't make the team, but I was, a couple places off from the team. For me, it was a really kind of exciting moment to see that there was a certain amount of potential realized. And it was also one of those things where I could walk away from that level of competition and from the sport, acknowledging that I hadn't accomplished everything that I might have wanted to, which I think is going to be the case with anybody who tries something at a high level. I mean, you're always aspirational and you're always creating a list of what you'd like to achieve, and rarely does that list get entirely ticked off. But what it showed for me, it was many things. One, I learned such a vast amount about training and about coaching, with observing and observing Scott and listening to him, and really being a mentee and sort of being under his tutelage and learning about what it takes to kind of build that training base long term. And so for me, it was exciting in the sense that as I shifted direction, I could sort of throw some of that fitness that I had into different pursuits that weren't at anywhere near that level of competition, but things like trail running and ski mountaineering racing.
Some of these other pictures, Scott, you guys could tell me a little bit about that. I think I see Ben here. What's
So this was at this is at Canmore, Canada, Alberta, Canada. They have a Nordic center there. That's where the 1988 Olympics were held, which I, like Sam, missed by one spot on the team. But I did compete there in some World Cup races. So they have a man-made, a loop where they can ski on man-made snow, actually snow that they save over the summer. They pile sawdust on it so the snow doesn't melt. And then they clear the sawdust off. And this was early October, I believe, when we were up there.
Mid-October,
We were up there for about a 10-day training camp, and there were a couple of races. And Sam performed super well in those races. And I want to talk a little bit about this trajectory or his career path with Sam too, relating to that picture you had up there earlier, Steve, the one from his penultimate nationals where Sam made the podium here. And I have to say that, I've coached a number of Olympians. I've coached people to podium finishes in World Cup races and cross-country skiing, that is, and even medals at World Championships. So, but I have to say that this was one of my proudest accomplishments as a coach. And I'll explain why. I mean, it was a great performance for Sam, personally, but for me, one of the things that it did is it validated all of these ideas that Sam and I have been developing for years and years, ideas that I'd have, and then we'd refine. We were spending a lot of time together, driving around to ski races, lots of time to talk about, kick these ideas around. And I don't think this will embarrass Sam when I say this, but so Sam was a guy who went through his entire college career never even making it to the NCAA national championships. And this U.S. national championships is at a much higher level than NCAA's, the college circuit. And so here's a guy who couldn't, while he was in college, go to the collegiate nationals. And here he is now competing for the Olympic team as one of the very top sprinters in the country. And I think that says a lot about, obviously, Sam's perseverance and his ability to get this job done, but also validates that, hey, we took these very specific training ideas and used them over the course of several years. And we took this guy from what I would say would have been kind of an intermediate collegiate level skier to one of the best in the country. So here's me and Sam, me testing his blood lactate during the middle of an interval workout. You'll notice that's a running track behind us. We were doing roller ski interval training on a running track so we could control the pace really closely. I think there's one or two others here, aren't there?
And there's one I wanted to show in terms of spending a lot of time together. I liked this picture because that illustrates
a lot of podcasts and hours on the road.
This is some history podcast we were listening to, I think.
But that was also hours and hours where we were just talking about training, and a lot of it, I'd say, especially as time went on, it wasn't necessarily talking about my training. It was just talking about these concepts. And, I was starting to coach juniors at that point. And so we're talking about, well, how do we take, this method that seems to be working for me and translate it into something that's applicable to a 16-year-old, because obviously we're not going to throw them into the deep end of the pool necessarily, but we want to, let's just evolve these ideas. And I feel like that was so much, at least for me, those embryonic stages of learning how to coach and learning how to take ideas and training concepts and make them applicable to a wide array of people and to really think about the individual and how they can respond to things.
I just wanted to inject something real quick there, because it's often a question that we've got received at Uphill Athlete is, how do I become a coach? And I want to say that that's what you just described is how you become a coach, in my opinion. Those are the best coaches that we've found. Those are the coaches that we've integrated into Uphill Athlete, the ones that have been athletes originally and kind of come up through years and years and years. It's not something I don't believe that you can learn in school. There's a lot of subjective as well as objective knowledge that goes into becoming a coach. And I think that that's an important point to take home here.
Yeah. So, certainly for me, I think, being able to experience those, the ups and the downs and how training worked. And then again, realizing that it's not it's not a manual where you just say, okay, this worked for me. Now I'm going to give you the same workout. But it's recognizing sort of the core concept of it and then figuring out, okay, what does this athlete need and how can they respond to it and how can we have a good dialogue? Because again, I think the greatest thing I took away from this whole experience and Scott's and my relationship, certainly as athlete and coach, was the success of it came not predominantly from those workouts necessarily as much as from the rapport and the relationship that we had. So Scott knew me, Scott knew what I needed. I felt comfortable and trusted him to communicate those things, and we could adapt that training. And, we could have tried a myriad of different techniques and strategies, many of which would have worked that maybe we didn't, but the point is that we were able to navigate that together and have the communication to see it through. And that's the takeaway I thought that I've tried to apply as a coach for sure.
And Steve, there's that last slide you had on there with Sam skating uphill. I think that bears a little, this is another one of our experiments. It's not easy to see because it's black, but Sam has a 60-pound weight vest on, and he's doing these uphill sprints on snow. So beginning of the ski season, we're still trying to extract some sort of maximal high-powered hill sprints that are very specific to his race. And so in order to help Sam, it was my job to ski out to the hill with that 60-pound vest. And I could barely get it out to I could barely stay on my skis. It was so challenging. And here Sam was skiing up the hill with perfect form. You can't even tell that he has a weight vest. This is actually a still.
I look a little bulky.
This is actually a still from a video. And if you saw the video, you'd realize that, you can't tell that he's got 60 pounds strapped to his body. Let's see.
And just lastly, I think we should maybe close a little bit on the on some of these other. Sorry for the, and I think back to Sam's point, just about his evolution as an athlete into more recent years. Can you speak about that? What's this picture? Where's this from, Sam?
Yeah, this is last summer. My wife Allison, who's also a UA coach, and I we ran the Wonderland Trail, which is 93 miles, I think. Around it circumnavigates Mount Rainier, and it's just a spectacularly beautiful route. And we had a goal of running it in a single push from one point and all the way around. And this was just as the sun was starting to set on one of the most beautiful sections of the trail. And for me, it was, one of, the longest single run I'd done. And I think, the evolution of myself as an athlete. I mean, when I was growing up, I never liked running. I did it because I knew I needed to, but it never felt very good. And I would get feedback sometimes from folks like, well, you're a bigger guy. You're not really meant to be a runner. Don't worry about it. And to have gone from that experience to come to really enjoy running and trail running, largely thanks to my wife who taught me really how to do it. But then to have an experience like that where I can, just be absolutely enthralled with, spending tens and that long, many miles out on a trail, and really enjoying it. I mean, that was fed by a base of training and really, a passion for training, I think. And, especially now, a lot of the dialogue we've had with our athletes over the last couple of months with COVID and the challenges of objectives being canceled and having to really retool our thinking about what are we training for? What's this paradigm now when we can't climb mountains or we can't run a race? And I know what my personal experience has been and what is, I think, really valuable to try to impart to other people is that the pursuit of training and trying to improve yourself in these various areas just lends this great versatility and opens up a lot of opportunities. And I came to really enjoy training for training's sake, because I enjoy the way it gives me these opportunities. I love kind of experimenting with it and seeing how it made me feel. But it was just such a great encapsulation of it, this run on the Wonderland. Being able to move across terrain like that was really special.
Great. I think that's a really great summary and place to leave it. Scott, do you have any closing arguments, any closing points you'd like to make?
No, I think that was a great summary by Sam. I think we've covered a lot of ground here. People understand, gotten the idea of where, how uphill athlete and all of us as coaches have gotten to this point. I want to remind people we're going to continue this process with our other coaches too, because they all have great stories. And then next week, that'll happen with Steve and Mark Postal, and they will be talking about training for and climbing Denali. We know that, of course, it's out for this year, but we know that a lot of the folks that come to our website and get in touch with us are interested in training for Denali. And Steve and Mark have extensive experience both guiding and climbing on Denali personally. So I think that's going to be a wonderful time for them to share a lot of that knowledge with us. So thanks for everybody for tuning in. Really appreciate it. And we'll look forward to, if you've got some questions about that we didn't get to today, feel free to email Sam or myself. That's Scott at Uphill Athlete or Sam at Uphill Athlete, and we'll get back to you with answers. So thanks a lot, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you both for sharing your story. It was really great. I'm sure it will inspire a lot of people. Thanks very much.
Yeah.
Right. Bye.
See you all out there.